This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Paul Seabright, who is a professor of economics at the University of Toulouse, and also the director of its Institute for Advanced Studies, which is an interdisciplinary think tank, I guess you could describe it as, a research center. And we'll talk about that. But also, you're the author of this book right here, The Company of Strangers, and also this other one, which I have here on my Kindle, which is called The War of the Sexes. And I saw how the second book really did build on some of the concepts and themes of the first book, but digs much more, I think, into the evolutionary biology side of things. And so maybe I'll start off, Paul, by saying, you use this phrase when you describe human beings as the shy, murderous ape. And, it's not usual that an economist uses a term like that to describe people. Normally, when you ask an economist, what is a person, they'll say something like they're a rational optimizer, right? Or, a constrained maximizer, or something to that effect. So I'm wondering, what drew you to biology? What drew you to anthropology? What drew you to these other disciplines that are adjacent to economics?
Well, I guess there are two answers to that. One is that, I hung around with a lot of biologists and anthropologists and people in my youth. I actually met Richard Dawkins before I graduated because I'd been advised by a tutor in philosophy to read up some sociobiology, which was the stuff that was happening at the time. And he put me in touch with Richard a very long time ago, when Richard had just become famous as the author of The Selfish Gene. And so I was interested in this stuff happening. And I then spent quite a lot of time with anthropologists and so on in my early days as a graduate student. And so for me, it was just a natural way of thinking about the world. And I almost felt that I had to put on a special uniform to be an economist. Whereas what I felt comfortable with was just thinking about human beings as this kind of population that you could study pretty much as in the nature movies that I watched in a very greedy way. I would watch, David Attenborough sort of loom over the horizon and film an ant's nest and say, it's really curious what's going on here. And I sort of felt that human societies were ripe for the same kind of treatment. And for me, it was always, I had to put on a special white coat to be an economist. It wasn't that I had to stop being an economist to do this other stuff. And the other thing was that it was about having kids. My kids were endlessly curious. We watched lots of these nature documentaries. And they always seemed a bit puzzled that they couldn't quite figure out how their dad, who they knew to be very curious and I hope fun, could be an economist, which all their friends at school would tell them was what their parents were seriously telling them they should do because it was sensible. And so a lot of the impulse of the book got out of explaining why economics is not sensible, why it's exciting and fun, and a bit transgressive, actually, that it, rather than showing you just the sort of rather high-minded picture of what human societies ought to be, it was, it's also about turning over the anthill and seeing what it really is in the blood and the violence and the mess.
Well, I think economists buy into the idea of kind of human exceptionalism in a way. And there's a long tradition of this. Certainly, the great chain of being, humans were above all the other animals and all the other primates, certainly. And I think in today's culture, we have, still have this in the broader culture, this idea of human exceptionalism. And I think part of your work is motivated by the desire to both at the one hand conflate that difference between humans and other animals and say we can study them all using the same tools, but then again to go double down on kind of human exceptionalism. You have this wonderful little fantasia in your book about in one of the books about a committee of primate anthropologists, where I don't know if you remember this, it was a while ago, but you have, a gorilla, a chimpanzee, and a bonobo, they're essentially, observing the human animal, and they observe all of these peculiarities about us. And the ones that you emphasize, you don't emphasize, they're the rational ones, they're the ones that use tools and use math and so forth. Instead, you emphasize certain aspects of our organizational, social, and reproductive strategies. So what exactly is the unique human niche? And then maybe you can also comment on, this idea of human exceptionalism.
Yes, I mean, I certainly got interested in the idea that humans occupy a very unusual niche, but not necessarily one that we should think of as being, the summit of natural possibility, but rather we ended up in this very unusual ecological niche, which had all sorts of unexpected consequences. So what's unusual about it is that we essentially developed in a way that led human babies to be born substantially premature. I mean, essentially all human babies are in intensive care for the first few years of their life. You don't have to think that Bambi is a piece of scientific natural history to be struck by the fact that, when the deer is born, it drops out of its mother's womb and it's sort of, gamboling around in the prairie very shortly afterwards. And human beings are not like that. So, we take a year of intensive care even to stand up, which is, pretty startling. And we all know the reason why that happened. The reason why that happened was that as humans started to walk upright, the need to maintain an upright gait meant that human mothers had to get rid of the babies growing in their wombs while their heads were still small enough to fit through the hole in the pelvis. And so essentially we very luckily and fortuitously colonized this niche in which we had to give birth very early in the process of the development of the baby. And this meant that that would only work if we had a social organization in which there were enough people around to help look after that baby, including not just the biological mother and not just the biological father, but also the aunts and the cousins and the uncles and the rest of the society. And Sarah Purdy has this wonderful description at several points. I think it's in Mothers and Others, where she says, if you show up in a village almost anywhere in the world where a mother has just given a birth and, assuming you're welcomed, one of the first things that will happen is people will hand you the baby to gurgle over. And, we share babies. But if you try going up to a chimp mother that's just given birth and try to borrow her baby in the same way, you'd be very lucky to get away with your life. Other apes don't share their babies, we share them. And so what happened was a series of near simultaneous developments in our physiology and lifestyle, where because of physiological constraints, we had to give birth to premature babies. And that was only feasible if we had the social organization available to look after them. And of course, that social organization then, as a side effect, a very beneficial side effect, brought with it the fact that once you've got people who are cooperating to look after babies, they can cooperate to do lots of other stuff.
Well, I mean, it seems like the defining characteristic of humans, as you mentioned, is that we are trusting. We trust other humans. And from an economist perspective, this seems almost irrational, at least when you do it with people who are not kin, or with people with whom you're not maintaining a very close tit-for-tat form of reciprocity. And if that's true, then first of all, it requires some kind of explanation, right? How do we go from kind of kin selection to this trusting relationship that we often have with strangers? And then the other question is, well, if this is a mismatch, in other words, it's a characteristic that evolved in an era where we were surrounded by relatives and so forth, then is it something that will, will evolve away from and become more rational and become more like economists and become less trusting. Game theorists would certainly have a hard time explaining the degree of trust that we have with one another.
Yes, that's exactly right. I think you can ask the question about how do we get to trust at two levels. One is, what's the rationale we have for trusting in everyday life? And there I really want to emphasize that we do this so naturally. It's so much a second nature that we forget how extraordinary it is. I mean, if I want to go out into the street and buy some food, I go into a shop and somebody I've never met in my life hands it over to me. If my ancestor of 50,000 years ago had gone up to a complete stranger and asked for some food, he would probably not have got away with his life. So I think it's really important to emphasize that it's become utterly second nature for us, so that it's not that we have a story we tell ourselves about why we trust people. It's that we do it so naturally that we often have to think about who not to trust. So, you tell kids, don't go walking in that neighborhood, it's not safe. Or you think to yourself, actually, I have to be careful about, that nice person who sent me the email promising to share, $1 million with me, is probably not somebody I should trust. I think although it's kind of weird that we do it, we now do it in such a natural way that we forget how weird it is. And then there's the question, how did it happen chronologically? What was the process by which it happened? And there, I think we have forgotten how many unsung heroes of prehistory lost their lives so that it could happen. I mean, there are an awful lot of people who made the first move towards contacting a tribe that they previously had no contact with, and who then left no trace in the genetic record because they lost their lives in the attempt. So all we know is that some people did it successfully, because we're here to tell the tale. We have no idea what the casualty rate was before it became a more natural and accepted thing to do. And I think that's one of the places where we have very little way of doing more than making casual conjectures, because it seems pretty clear that contacts between geographically separated human communities go back a long way. One plausible conjecture actually is that a lot of it had to do with outmarrying, so that unlike what chimps do, which is basically where adolescent females leave the main paternal group and then move out and eventually find another group to join. What's quite likely is that in humans, we evolved a process by which the adolescent female didn't go out just by herself. She went out with a family group, and that helped to make ties possible between the groups. There's actually a moment that for me makes, which this isn't science, this is imagination, but at the end of Cormac McCarthy's novel, The Road, where things have been building up to what you think is going to be the most awful, terrible climax. But I mean, you've seen signs of violence as it goes, and there's this very small group, the father and the son, arrive near the end of their journey, and they spot another group. And for a moment, everything is very fraught, because you think, my God, they're outnumbered, they're going to get slaughtered. And then you realize that group has an adolescent female. And suddenly, I mean, it's, to the reader, we all know it. We don't have to be told why that's important. We all suddenly feel, oof, that's the best scenario they could have, because they then have a shared interest in the mating of the successful mating of these two young individuals. So I think it's plausible that some of the first human contacts were around mating, and that, unlike in the case of say chimps, where it's entirely the initiative of the adolescent female, fairly early on in the process, adults got involved. But we don't know that, and that's not the kind of thing that fossil evidence can tell us very easily.
Well, I think what a lot of people find puzzling is the this notion of reciprocity, which appears to be at least partially hardwired, that you highlight in the book, it seems like it's not mutation resistant, right? I mean, if we all have this, I mean, Robert Cialdini writes about it. If somebody gives you something, you feel almost compelled to give something back, right? When we do the trust game, for instance, when people are given some kind of pot and the pot doubles, people feel compelled to give something back, even though they don't have to. I'm always surprised when I read stories about, say, someone who is a prisoner in Auschwitz, and they give a guard like their watch, and then they get out of the death lane. I mean, it's like, wait, this is like a murderous, this is a person who is, in the business of like exterminating people. Like, why would that individual feel any compunction to honor a deal like that, right? I mean, you mentioned that trust is kind of the mortar of society. It's not entirely about fear of punishment, but rather there's this internal sense of obligation. How is this mutation resistant? Why don't the con artists and the reneging individuals exploit this kind of weakness in human nature?
Well, they do, and what's interesting, I think, is that it seems pretty convincing to me that not only is it not mutation resistant, but pure selfishness isn't mutation resistant either. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that the evidence seems pretty strong that social preferences in human beings are in what the biologists call balanced polymorphism. That is to say, there isn't a single dominant genotype that has higher fitness than all of the others. What seems to be true is that the fitness of particular genotypes is frequency dependent. So basically, if everybody is trusting, then the returns to being a sociopath are very high. But if everybody's a sociopath, there are actually some significant returns to being trusting. Obviously, if you're the only trusting individual in an entire community of sociopaths, then it's going to be difficult to realize the benefits. But if you can manage to be a small group of altruistic and reciprocal individuals in a community of sociopaths, you can actually do pretty well. You can do a lot better than they can. So I think and why do I say the evidence for that is strong? I think the reason for that is that in almost all of the behavioral studies that I've ever seen, you never find that all of the subjects in the experiment display reciprocity. There's always a proportion who don't. And you never find that everybody's selfish either. There's always at least some proportion who are reciprocal. Now, in different communities and different times and different circumstances, the proportions of the altruistic and the reciprocal and the spiteful and the completely selfish and so on vary. And there are interesting things to be said about that. But what's interesting is that I don't think I've ever seen a single study that tries to tease out what kinds of social preferences, what kinds of preference configuration there are in a population that has ever come up with with evidence to say that one of them has higher fitness than all of the others. They're all frequency dependent. And I think that's one of the most intriguing findings of all, that basically the returns to being either selfish or trusting or whatever are critically dependent on what proportion of other types there are in the population.
Well, and presumably trustworthiness is not genotypically coded, right? Presumably it's environmentally contingent. So, we can rapidly switch from being suspicious people to trusting people, reciprocal people to guarded people, depending on the environment in which we find ourselves, presumably. You spent a lot of time in the post-Soviet world, and those experiences pop up from time to time in your writing. Could you talk maybe how does the environment shape our propensities towards trust and trustworthiness?
Well, we know from other primates that behavior is extremely malleable with respect to circumstances. So, for example, it's pretty clear that the propensity for violence is much greater in chimps than it is in humans, other things equal. And Richard Wrangham has this wonderful recent book called The Goodness Paradox, which is all about sort of what the process was by which the patterns of violence that we see in chimps were modified over time, and how human beings came to show essentially much less emotional and reactive violence and much more cool-headed and strategic violence than chimps do. Now, why do I say that? I say that because even in chimps, who display much more emotional and uncontrollable violence than we do, we know that their propensity for aggression, for example, is highly dependent on fairly simple details of their foraging patterns. So, if you get a group of 4 chimps comes across another group of 5 chimps on the boundaries of their respective territories, it's pretty likely that nothing is going to happen. But if you get 4 chimps meet a solitary individual, then the probability of aggression against that solitary individual is extremely high. And it seems that even if the chimps in some sense may be responding proximally to anger, aggression, various kinds of things that may be hormone driven, all of that is strongly responding to environmental cues. Now, the same thing is surely true of us, in the sense that we almost certainly have much less tendency to flare up. Somebody jostles us in a subway, most of the time we don't lash out. And when you get occasional bits of violence in a crowded subway, it's remarkable because of how unusual they are, in spite of the fact people are jostling each other all the time. If you put chimps into a crowded space, then it would be a massacre very quickly. So we clearly have, I would say, physiologically encoded capacities to manage the stresses of being in close confinement with other humans much better than others do. But our reactions are also highly environmentally dependent, and dependent on things that are both the sort of subtle and often unconscious interpretation of cues we get from others, including, do they piss us off? Do they make us angry? Do we kind of not like the look of them in ways that we can't really give an impression on, or we can't give an explanation on? But also cognitive ways. So Rajiv Sethi and Brendan O'Flaherty have this wonderful book called Shadows of Doubt, which is about stereotypes and criminal justice. And they talk about how an awful lot of violence is inflicted between people because of fears that others will be violent. So one of the reasons why having guns around is conducive to homicide is not that, so to speak, I have this uncontrollable urge to kill somebody and a gun is there and then I've got to do it.
It primes you towards vigilance.
It's that you have the gun and I'm terrified that if I don't shoot first, you'll get me first. And so, cognitive processes are in there. It's not just uncontrollable emotions. So we're clearly picking up cues from our environment the whole time. And part of, I think, the wonder, the miracle of modern human society is that with lots and lots of false starts and big backward steps, we've managed to construct particularly urban environments in which a lot of those environmental cues are actually good at stabilizing violent impulses and not inflaming them. And that doesn't mean we don't have the violent impulses, but it means that we have put in place a whole sequence of environmental cues that tend to dampen them. But that also tells us that certain settings, which can often be exploited, for example, by political entrepreneurs or military entrepreneurs for their own interests, can then turn off those dampers and actually make the violent impulses flare up again. So, if you want to encourage people in a pogrom against some minority, then there's now almost, handbooks could be written about how you do it. And what are the environmental cues you have to put in place so that not only will your troops be prepared to go in and and kill the minority that you want to get rid of, but then also feel sort of morally justified in doing so and self-righteously proud of what they've done and all of this kind of stuff, which again is about creating sets of environmental cues that take certain kinds of propensities and use them then for the political or military entrepreneurs' purposes.
Well, if trust is so important, and it's important that we know who's trustworthy, it's important to develop the capacity to signal one's trustworthiness. You talk a bit about, in both books, you talk about kind of costly signaling models, and you mentioned laughing and smiling, and I think this is kind of similar to some stuff that Robert Frank was writing about. But what I find interesting is that these signals don't operate just at the individual level, but they operate at, say, the corporate level, right? Through branding. How do we take those very simple kind of face-to-face signaling models and parlay them up into these larger institutional signals?
I think it's a really interesting question, and clearly we carry around implicitly in our heads some pretty complex models of the way society functions. So, if you think of, this has been happening a lot in the pandemic, there's somebody rings my doorbell and, I go down and I open the gate and, it's somebody I've never seen before, some guy who's, potentially quite violent. Do I open the gate just like that? No, I don't, because the guy is wearing, I don't know, the Amazon uniform or the whatever. And, what kicks in is a complex model that I have.
This guy could be wanting to, rob your house and rape your children. And I mean, and you just open the door to this person.
Yeah.
Kind of remarkable.
And again, the inference process is lightning fast. Because, if it's somebody wearing, the uniform of Amazon or of some firm from which I buy a dishwasher, then I do it very, very quickly. If it's a uniform, but not one I've ever seen before, I might stop and I would think, and then I would sort of figure out, okay, what kind of company has that uniform? So there is implicitly a complex model in which I have the whole human resources department of that company in mind and thinking about what are their incentives to do background checks on people. And when you have innovations in corporate organization like Uber, then people start to ask themselves these questions. Okay, so I think lots of people hadn't asked themselves why it might be important that it was so difficult to get a taxi license until Uber came along and people realized that actually in a world in which it's much easier to become an Uber driver than to get a taxi license, there may be hidden dangers. And then, of course, people started to ask themselves questions. Uber itself started to implement new policies and to make a lot of fuss about how to do that. And so I often think that it's when you get an innovation in a corporate form that suddenly you realize that all of these inferences that were going in your head under the radar of consciousness have to be brought up into consciousness and inspected. So, I mean, I mentioned, I think in the Company of Strangers, that this experiment that I've been doing for years now with students, in which I just show them a picture of a table in Africa with stuff on it, and I say what's going on, and the students say, "Oh yeah, it's obviously a market." And so I say, "Who's buying and who's selling?" And they instantly tell me that it's the boy who's selling and the adults who are buying. And then I point out to them that statistically, even in Africa, it's unusual for the child to be selling. So what makes them so sure? And they eventually figure out painfully that it's because the adults are looking at what's on the table and the boy isn't. And the only person who can afford not to look at what's on the table is the person who put it there, because he knows what the quality is. So it's clearly the adults who are looking at the produce. The boy doesn't have to, because the boy is trying to figure out the adult's willingness to pay. But what's interesting about that is that all of that inference is done in a twinkling of an eye. And the people who do it can't explain how they were so sure that it was the boy who was selling until we go through this process of explaining. And so I think similarly, when you go to your front door and there are some people who just are prepared to let in like that, we're going through a similar process of inference, which, I mean, it's part of what's fun about being an economics teacher, that you get these students who make these incredibly sophisticated inferences the whole time. And then you say to them, like, how do you know? And it takes them quite a long time to figure out.
Well, when we look at societies that are organized around, say, family firms or small communities, I think it's not that much of a stretch to see how those forms of social organization are extensions of what we had in forager society or, small scale agricultural society. But when you move to these larger firms and these more complex markets, that's where it's kind of harder to see how these modules that we developed, cognitive modules, apply. Right. So, in the U.S., I mean, you talk about Alfred Chandler and how the birth of these large firms that are not family firms. You're inviting in outside investors who are more or less strangers. And then in today's world, where we're not working at the same firm for our entire lifetime, but rather we're constantly firm hopping. It's harder to understand how these structures operate. And if it was all about carrots and sticks, it would be easier for us to understand. But as you say, that there's quite a bit of trust that's sitting there as glue that's making the whole thing work. So how is this step seems to be I mean, we've had large states, for instance, like the Roman Empire for a long time, but this move to these large scale organizations and complex markets, this seems to be a dramatic leap for humanity. How did this happen?
Okay, well, once again, the question of how it happened historically and what underpins it today are not the same question. So let me actually move ahead to what underpins it today. And if we have time, I'll come back to how it happened historically. One of the things I wish I had devoted more time to in The Company of Strangers, and actually will be an explicit theme in the book I'm working on now, is the importance of narratives in cementing trust in institutions. The example I gave just now, which was very much the kind of example I had in the back of my mind when I wrote The Company of Strangers, it is all about how you can trust individual transactions. So, I transact, I buy a dishwasher, and then the person comes to the door of my house and offers to install the dishwasher, and I let them in, even though, if they were in intention towards me, that could be fatal. So I presented it in terms of how can we have enough trust to undertake a single transaction. But of course, a large part of people's lives are passed in a set of repeated interactions with institutions of various kinds. And I think that, again, when I was writing The Company of Strangers, I was probably still a bit too much in the under the influence of the game theoretic literature on repeated games, where, in some sense, you just think of the fact of repetition as kind of cementing your ability to trust individuals because you're going to interact with them in the future. And as it happens, I think that's a very good parable for the process by which trust can get started in the early stages. So I think I mentioned in the book, but I've often used it as an example with students since. There's a great description by Herodotus of exchanges in the Libyan desert between Carthaginians and Libyans, where they engage in this silent trade where they never actually talk to each other, but they put goods on the ground and they put gold, and then they sort of dance to and fro until the amount of goods is, in the eyes of both sides, equivalent to the amount of gold, and then they go away with their own stuff. And the question you ask is, why doesn't at some point one of the parties just grab everything and run? And the only plausible answer to that is that they realize that they'll never have an opportunity like this again if that's what you do. So this repeated game reasoning is very good at understanding how you would get something going that hadn't been sort of going before. But I don't think it's very satisfactory for explaining, why people would spend their lives working for General Motors or or for that matter, for a political party or a government or something like that. And the growth of large enterprises in the late 19th century and the 20th century was not, I think, explicable only in terms of economies of scale and production, although that is a big part of the story. But what you had to explain was how you would get people to essentially invest a lot of their sense of self-worth in this organization, which is a rather abstract thing. And there's lots of examples which have been much discussed by sociologists and not very much by economists about the way in which big firms tried to inculcate loyalty. So there's great stories of the way Ford, for example, would, in fact, these examples have been cited very often of the famous melting pot at the Ford company headquarters in Dearborn, where people would arrive in their national costume and they would jump into the melting pot and they would come out dressed in American business suits as a kind of parable for the way in which the firm was creating a common identity. Now, the big thing that I think that we're in danger of losing from that was that what the firms often did, and sometimes it was almost below the level of consciousness, was to reproduce the narrative that many communities have created since time immemorial, which is that we look after you as a child. We send you out into the world to do battle with enemies and dragons and so on. And then you come back and this is a very masculine-based narrative. But of course, many of these firms were masculine redoubts that tried to win the authority, the loyalty of their male employees with this idea that you will go and struggle in your working life, but then we look after you afterwards. So when you retire, you will never fully leave the company. You will belong to a community of former employees. You get your pension and so on. So there's this idea, which is common to all of the great epic stories in ancient and modern literature. This idea that the individual is engaged in a kind of quest in their life, which is that as they grow out, they go and they do the dangerous stuff and they fight the battles, but then they're looked after. And this idea of the community welcomes people in afterwards. Now, there's obviously a whole set of questions as the 20th century wore on about where do women fit into this story? Because, in the traditional, conquering the dragon, killing the dragon, slaying the dragon myth, then the damsel is waiting for the hero and she just sort of falls into his arms and says, yes, please. And she's not engaged in a similar kind of heroic myth or heroic narrative herself. And clearly something had to give in the way firms were organized, that they had to give a role to the working woman and not just say that it's the job of the woman to be there for when the man kind of returns from his quest. But of course, then the other thing was when you realize that more and more there are demands in modern life for people to be flexible. People who are going to be Uber drivers, many of them want flexibility, but what flexibility doesn't deliver is a narrative about your place in the wider whole. You may at a period in your young life be thrilled to be an Uber driver because you can fit it around looking after your kids or doing a second job or doing a more lucrative job, but which you can't do all the time. But I think Uber is great in lots of ways, but it doesn't offer people this kind of sense of belonging that those big firms used to. And of course, not only did big firms do that, but trade unions did, particularly obviously in Europe more than in the US. If you think about the language that the trade unions used, it was very much almost this military language. People with the class struggle it's just like slaying the dragon. When you're young, you will fight on the barricades and you will advance the interests of your working brothers. And then, of course, the trade union looks after you later in life because it ensures that you have health benefits, you have the ability to be part of a community when you get older and when you no longer have the physical strength to fight. And I do think that we've sort of lost the ability for organizations other than churches and political parties to provide this sort of narrative of fulfillment in life. And that leaves obviously the field wide open for all sorts of entrepreneurs to come in with more dangerous narratives saying, okay, now my political party will offer you, the opportunity to achieve fulfillment through, fighting. Now the dangers are immigrants or, some other kind of scapegoatable population, and you will get your sense of fulfillment through taking part in the fight against them. So this has been rather lengthy, but what I mean to say is that I think in the company of strangers, I focus too much on what makes a transaction something that, what gives us enough trust for a transaction, and not enough on what creates the narrative under which we are willing to grant organizations, which are very abstract things, our loyalty. I treated loyalty as though it was something that we essentially give to people. But I think we give loyalty to very abstract organizations, and I'm still figuring out how we do that.
Well, I think, sociologists and economists from Marx and Durkheim on have been saying that the market destroys these strong ties and replaces them with weak ties, and eliminates this sense of belonging, and replaces everything with the cash nexus. And I think, especially in today's world, where at least in Silicon Valley, the average life expectancy of an employee at a company is 14 months. It's kind of hard to develop a strong sense of belonging at Facebook when you're leaving Facebook after a year. But in a way, this replacement of strong ties with weak ties is part of the strength of the system. I think, when you argue about, tunnel vision and how tunnel vision is really the secret to the success of this very, very complex economic system that we have, is there a way to have both? How do we leverage the weak ties and the strong ties? What kind of institutions can we lean on to bolster those strong ties? Because you mentioned churches. I think most people would say that churches are in decline pretty much everywhere.
Absolutely not. No. They've been in decline in Europe for some period of time. They're in decline in parts of the US, but in the world as a whole, churches are doing better than they've ever done before. Churches have been expanding in Africa and in Asia. Look at China, where there are now, it's difficult to get reliable figures, but there are, by most plausible estimates, there are now more Christians in China, active Christians in China, than members of the Communist Party. Churches globally are doing very well indeed. And so I don't think that, I think there's a lot of things that can be said about the role that churches play in all this. But if I come back to the question of sort of strong versus weak ties and markets, of course, you're right that people from Marx and Durkheim and many others have talked about the way in which markets can undermine certain kinds of strong tie. But I think that until recently, the way in which that's been construed has been rather oversimplistic. It's been assumed by many people that markets encourage selfish behavior and that you need to have these strong ties in order to behave unselfishly. I think the evidence is now overwhelmingly against that. And that, so for example, one of the most fascinating studies published in the American Economic Review in the last half century was a study published in 2000, I think, or maybe 2001 by a large team of people, including Joe Henrich and Rob Boyd, Sam Bowles, and Herb Gintis, and many others, looking at experiments testing for the presence of social preferences, including reciprocity, altruism, and so on, in a wide range of societies across the world. And what I think almost all the authors of the study expected was that they would find that the societies which had been most penetrated by market relations would be the ones where people were most selfish. And they found the exact opposite. They found that it was in the societies where people had become most used to market relations that actually people displayed the greatest spontaneous generosity, altruism, but also reciprocity. Now, what does that mean? And that means, I think, that market relations to work at all are and have to be profoundly moral, but in a rather limited sense of the word moral. Moral in the sense that, to a first approximation, or in spite of the presence of many charlatans and cheats and so on, when you go into a simple market transaction, by and large, you do what you say you're going to do. And, if that were the default presumption, market relations wouldn't have been able to get going. And I think that's a remarkable fact because, as you point out, straightforward selfish calculation often suggests this wouldn't be a very smart thing to do. But it is what is the default mode for most people most of the time. I think the more sophisticated and deep concern that people like Marx and Durkheim and Weber articulated was that the deeply moral relationship, which is a market relationship, is nevertheless based on acts and transactions and not really on a deep sense of belonging. In other words, I can treat you with respect. I can treat you with dignity because we're transacting. But in the end, at the end of the transaction, you go your way and I go mine. And we don't lose too much sleep over each other. Whereas it's part of belonging that people don't just drop off the edge of your universe. And that, I think, is the sort of deeper concern that in a market society, it's just too easy for people to drop off the edge of your universe, and you never really know in the end who you can count on. Once again, we shouldn't exaggerate that. I mean, my friend Sheila Ogilvie reminded me a couple of years ago that in medieval Europe, people were always dropping off the edges of other people's universes because if you set out to travel from Augsburg to Vienna, the probability you wouldn't arrive at the end of your journey was really very high. I mean, you would get robbed, you would get murdered. So actually people were dropping off the edges of each other's universes really rather often. And part of the achievement of societies like modern Europe and the United States is that by and large, when people set out, they get to their destination, which was not the case until relatively recently. But nevertheless, one of the things that we tried to do in those earlier, more violent societies was to create presumptions of belonging to, churches were very important in that, but so were families, so were various other kinds. All of those institutions that Robert Putnam described in Northern Italy and many others have been documented around the world were things that people were expected to continue belonging to. And that's the bit that we've not been good at reproducing, which is partly why actually churches do very well in the modern world. Because, if your job takes you from a small town in rural Ohio to, Denver, Colorado, or Los Angeles, or New York City, or even to Columbus. You suddenly don't necessarily know who your neighbors are, and your church is often the place that provides you with the best substitute for the community you used to have. And so there you have something where the modern market economy is disrupting your original ties in your village or town of origin, and it's the church that is substituting for that in the big city to which you travel.
Well, and one of the reasons why we see immigrant success is because when you enter a new country, you have an immediate marker, which kind of ropes off a group of people that you can presumably count on and trust to support you, as distinct from the kind of pool of broad, undifferentiated population in which you find yourself.
Yeah. Including, paradoxically, people that you wouldn't touch with a barge pole if it was back in your country of origin. But once you have to trust them, then you do.
So I want to shift to we were talking about human exceptionalism and how we think about it in the 21st century. And I think when it comes to gender roles, I think we as humans, particularly in the 21st century, we believe that humans are different from all the other species, and that our sex differences, gender differences are almost infinitely plastic. In your book, I think you kind of walk through a little bit of a richer story where you talk about how bargaining power between the sexes has evolved, and it's a story of scarcity, and how in some species the females are in a stronger bargaining position, and others the males, depending on what resource is scarce within that species. I wonder if you could just recap that argument, and then we'll talk a bit about the workplace.
Okay, so among the gender differences, among the differences of our sexual and gender relations compared to that of other animals, is first that we one of the rare species that does bidirectional signaling. So most other species, you either get, the male will be the one with the gorgeously colored feathers, and the female will be dowdy, or the male nightingale will be singing the very elaborate song, and the female will be listening. And the reason for that is that, in a sense, females are scarcer than males, or to be more accurate, mating opportunities with females are scarcer than mating opportunities with males. And so the scarcity determines that it's the males that display and the females that choose. Now, obviously, in some species, the females don't choose, because what happens is that males fight it out, and it's the strongest male that then monopolizes the available females. And in human beings, we have this sort of very complex mixture of things where females do a lot of choosing, but females also do a lot of signaling. And the reason for that is that, unlike in a lot of other species, what the females are looking for from the males is not just the DNA or the sperm, if you like. It's they're looking for quality, and quality means the willingness of the male to invest time, energy, resources, protection, whatever it may be, to enhance the ability of the female's offspring to survive and flourish. And so females display, males display, and in particular, the successful partnerships of females and males that are the ones that give the greatest fitness to the offspring are the ones in which the female and the male have some continued relationship. Now, many people pointed out, for example, Sarah Hrdy has very importantly drawn attention to the fact, that she's far from alone in this, but she's very nicely expressed the important point that collaborative parenting, which is crucial to the human way of organizing things, doesn't necessarily mean nuclear families. And it doesn't, the biological father doesn't have to be the person who collaborates with the mother to look after the child, but the mother has to collaborate with somebody. I mean, it may be with her sisters, it may be with her mother, her aunts, it may be with other males. I mean, different societies have different kind of ways of organizing that, but looking after a baby on your own is essentially impossible. I mean, it's possible in modern societies if you have a welfare state and stuff like that, but in no functioning human society do mothers ever look after their offspring completely alone. They always have help. And then the question is, how can we best organize that help? And so I think that, and that's very, very unusual because, mother chimp, essentially, she gets the sperm from the father and that's it. And the same is true of very, very large numbers of animals. There are some fascinating exceptions. Birds are one, for the obvious reason that once the egg is laid, the mother can't go and forage because she leaves the egg unprotected. Whereas a mother chimp can take the baby chimp and go forage. So, eggs really changed the equation because eggs require males to take part. And there are some primates, and marmosets are a fascinating example in which the males give a lot of protection and food. And fascinatingly, primatologists can tell when a female marmoset is pregnant more easily by observing the male putting on fat than by observing changes in the female, because the male gets ready when the female, of whom is the social partner, becomes pregnant, to then devote energy and care to the infant. But so, although there are exceptions, marmosets being one, many birds being another, where you've got a lot of paternal care, humans are pretty far off the charts in that. And that determined, now, because that's a complex collaborative relationship, like all complex collaborative relationships, it has a gazillion ways to go wrong. And so all of the richness of kind of modern literature is about the case it goes wrong. And the way in which we think about how to manage gender relations in the modern world, where, although there's been some pushback in recent years on the idea of man the hunter, of men always doing hunting, it was still, I think, broadly accepted that in many societies, the bulk, if not the totality of calories from hunting were found by males. But of course, we don't live in a hunting society anymore, and most kinds of modern work are much more like gathering than they are like hunting. So there's every reason why men and women can collaborate in that process, but we haven't quite figured out what are the best ways to collaborate along the multiple dimensions of, say, collaborating in a modern firm and collaborating in a modern family. So one of the things about families is that kids can fall sick at any time. So there has to be some set of understandings among the people looking after the kid as to what's the default rule when the kid falls sick, whose responsibility is it. Unfortunately, lots of modern firms are like families in the sense that they're complicated structures of tasks. And when something goes wrong, somebody has to, there has to be a set of rules as to who, when there's a fire breaks out in the factory, or when there's some disaster goes wrong in the office, who's going to take care of that? And I think there's no simple answer to how you combine the web of responsibilities in family with the web of responsibilities in firm, given that every person is going to be a member of more than one of these networks. So I think it's not surprising that there's, in a sense, that there are no perfect solutions. But what's to me amazing, and I mean, I do talk a lot in the book about how strange it is in some ways that we see so little difference between men and women in almost all of the competencies that you could think of, the cognitive competencies and so on. I mean, there are some slight things that men do better than women and some things that women do better than men. But overall, it's just astonishing how kind of omnicompetent men and women are, because in almost all other animals, there are huge differences between the sexes in terms of how they function. And what's really amazing in human beings is how few those differences are and how trivial they are. And essentially all men and all women are, by the standards of everything else we know in the natural world, just spectacularly competent multitaskers. And, a lot of this pseudoscience about do men or women do multitasking better is just speculation, because the dominant fact is that we all multitask so much better than any other animal known to us in nature.
Well, so males and females can be equally competent in most domains, but the importance of signaling could differ, right?
Absolutely.
One of the things you point out is how much wasteful effort and energy goes into this signaling. And then you offer a hypothetical. I don't think you stop, but what if the peacock could simply just show a little 23andMe app and say, look, man, I'm the one with the good genes. Then we wouldn't have to waste any time with the display or anything like that. All this waste could disappear. We could just credibly signal our quality.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is figuring out a signal that that would work, because, you know, it may be true that, for example, a lot of sexual attraction is about it is your body telling you that it has figured out that the genes of the person that you're looking at are high quality genes. But I mean, it's still the case that we don't feel turned on by somebody's genes. We feel turned on by the proxies that have come to stand in for the quality of those genes. And so, you know, sexual desire retains its deeply mysterious quality. And by the way, I think there's something subversive about, and it makes it very difficult to write about sexual desire in a context where you're trying at the same time to be sort of politically sensitive. And so, because the whole point about political sensitivity is that you want to treat different people in a just way. You don't want to arbitrarily make distinctions between people. You don't want to discriminate and so on. And yet the fact is that sexual desire is intensely discriminating. I mean, it's just, you know, you feel sexual desire for X and not for Y. And you may feel sexual desire for X today, but not next week. And these are things you can't explain, because even if there was a rationale in natural selection for why you have that ability to get drawn to certain characteristics, when, you know, it's still, that's the explanation for how you got there, but it's not an account of what it is that you feel desire for today. And so I think that this, part of what's difficult politically about managing sex and gender in the workplace is that at the heart of it, there are these desires that are not easily, you know, we can't just tell ourselves, you know, I should feel the same kind of desire for everybody, old, young, beautiful, not beautiful, dark, light, talented, untalented. You know, all of the things we try to do politically, treating people fairly and in non-discriminatory ways, tend to get overturned by the sheer unpredictability of sexual desire. And obviously there's one solution to that, which is people say, okay, right, you know, we basically banish sex from the workplace completely. We treat it, we essentially, we know it's a fiction, but it's a necessary fiction. We have to assume that everybody behaves as though their sexual existence was completely irrelevant to the work they do. And that works up to a point. But then, you know, people meet in workplaces and they become attracted to each other and they start relationships, and you know, you then can't separate these things out anymore, and that's really tough. And I just, you know, there are obviously very bad ways that goes wrong, including harassment in the workplace and so on. But there are also no perfect ways to deal with it either. Because if you try to, for example, say there should never be sexual relationships in the workplace, and with them all of the partiality that gives rise to, then you condemn people to finding it difficult to find partners when it's the people they work with, the people they spend most of their time with.
Well, even if people treated each other in the workplace in a sort of gender neutral way, I'm not sure that would really affect the distribution of representation in the different tiers, right? I mean, you point out the percentage of women in senior positions is quite low in organizations, you know, of all kinds. And why wouldn't we just look at that and say, well, that's like the peacock's tail, right? I mean, we don't say that the male and female peacocks have unequal tails. We say they have, you know, different tails. Why couldn't we just say that this is, as long as women are attracted to CEOs instead of janitors, you know, we're going to have, you know, a higher representation of males among CEOs, because they're going to invest, males are going to invest more resources in achieving those large tails at the expense of many other things, including health and life expectancy and, other sorts of bad outcomes.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And indeed, in the last chapter of the book, one of the things I'm very uncomfortable about a lot of what is written about unequal representation, because I personally can't imagine in any conceivable universe wanting to be a CEO of a large company. To me, it's just a crazy thing to want to do. To me, it's not alive. Okay. So, when women friends of mine say they don't want to do that either, I think, good on you. I mean, how sensible. At the same time, I'm troubled by the fact that there are only 8% of CEOs in the top CEOs in the US are women. It was, when I wrote the book, it was 2.5%. So it's moved on a bit. But do I really think that the ideal world is one in which it's 50-50? Well, depends on how you put the question. Do I think women would be happiest if 50% of them were able to be CEOs? No, I don't think they do, because I suspect that more women than men, for the reasons why you suggest, will tend to think that being CEO is not really worth the extraordinary exhaustion, humiliation, overwork that the job requires. What do I think is the real cost of that? The real cost of that is that so many firms which create the job of CEO in such a way that it's almost unperformable, except by somebody with almost outrageously eccentric tastes and for narcissistic display, overwork, craving for attention, and so on. It's the firms that create the job of CEO in some sense to make it unperformable by everybody except that, which in the process deny themselves this extraordinary pool of female talent among women who just don't want to do that kind of job. And, so I work quite a lot on why female executives are paid less than male executives. And, I really have to emphasize that I'm not losing sleep over the fact that very privileged women are slightly less privileged than even more privileged men. I'm losing sleep over the fact that these companies are not using female talent because of the way in which they structure their governance, so that the job of CEO is almost impossible to undertake except by people with a very, very peculiar set of characteristics.
You mentioned the importance of narratives, and you mentioned that the kind of the only hero narratives that we have in our society are ones that are really traditionally male hero narratives, right? And so, rather than inventing a different set of narratives, I think have we not sort of said to women, "Hey, here's the template. You need to switch over to this template," rather than creating a new template or a new set of stories that would be more compatible with what gives females fulfillment and is more in alignment with their preferences and motivations.
Well, I mean, this is a great question, and I think is a tough one to answer. I mean, there is a set of theories that says that storytelling was an essentially male activity for a very large part of human prehistory and history, because it was like a peacock's tail, that essentially, to put it crudely, men told stories in order to get laid, and that women didn't need to tell stories, or at least they didn't need to tell that kind of story, although they would be telling stories to their children and maybe to their sisters and so on. They would be telling a different sort of story, which is a story that's more about it's not about heroic qualities. It's about in the case of children, it's about teaching the children to master their fears, which, I mean, as we know, some children's stories are terrifying. They're terrifying in a controlled way. They're terrifying in order for the child and the mother, in some sense, to work through a set of fears together. So I think that there's a lot of things to be said about where these hero narratives come from. It's not accidental that they were told by men, and they were told by men in a way that that gave heroic roles to men and didn't give heroic roles to women. Now, why can't our narrative conventions evolve? Well, they can, but again, the question is going to be who gets rewarded for telling the narratives that we will find newly rewarding. And, we've seen, obviously, in recent years, enormous changes in the makeup of who writes fiction, who makes movies, but these are industries like other industries, and for some of the same reasons that CEOs remain overwhelmingly male, which is not because the job itself can't be done by women, but because the way we've structured it, many women don't find the job attractive. And so, for example, if you take the creative industries, many ways in which, say, movie studios have been organized until relatively recently have been ones in which it was very hard for women to do the job in a way that they found was rewarding because of the way in which the whole thing was structured. So that narratives that are central to our culture, including, all the Disney narratives that kids grow up with, have been made by males in exactly the same way as, the hero narratives of the ancient Greeks and the Persians and so on were also told by males. So I think there's just a vast amount of cultural unpicking to be done. Now, it's happening partly. I mean, more and more women are making movies, and interestingly, I think they're making often different kinds of movies. Now, there's obviously overlap. There are a lot of women who make movies like what most men make, and there are a lot of men who make movies like what most women make. But I still think that the corpus of movies made by women is interestingly different overall from the corpus made by men, and those differences are worth exploring. I mean, in other words, the goal of I think a progressive creative industry should not be for women to make the same kind of movies that men have always been making, because the kinds of movies that men have been making are part of the problem with the wider culture.
Mm-hmm. And one thing you mentioned is that the women tend to have more strong ties and men have more weak ties, and that in the kinds of marketplaces that we're operating now, it's really helpful to have these weak ties. I think there have been some ways that some interventions that have been done to kind of help develop these weak ties. I know the American Economics Association did an experiment where they were, created a group of women economists who would forge weak ties with each other, and their careers were advanced much more quickly than people who were not put into this treatment group. So perhaps encouraging more weak ties for women in the workplace, or maybe figuring out ways to make strong ties more powerful could redress some of this imbalance.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And let's not underestimate some of the benefits of technology. I mean, everybody says, oh, you have to have personal context to get jobs and so on. But electronic networks and social networks and so on can substitute for some of the things that the old purely human relational based networks could do. Now, that's not to say that there won't be differences between the way in which men use those networks and women use those networks. But and I emphatically don't believe that in a sense, our problems of gender in the workplace will have been solved once there is no statistical distinction between the kinds of work that men do and the kinds of work that women do. Because I do think there will continue to be differences in preferences. I'm not saying they're hardwired. I mean, those differences in preferences come from a whole complex set of considerations, which are cultural and historic. And, there are without doubt some more kind of physical and physiological contributions to differences in the way in which men and women work, but a large part of that is cultural. I don't think it's particularly interesting or illuminating to try and figure out what is the exact contribution of those different parts. But the main point is that women should be free to do the kind of work that they're best fulfilled at. And if it turns out that they choose differently from what men choose, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, the last thing we want to do is to create conditions in which women feel obliged to work the same kind of jobs that men have always been done for fear of letting down their sisters, or make the same kind of movies that male directors have always made for fear of being thought somehow not up to the artificial standards that male movie directors have created. So, I mean, at the end of the book, I do say that actually in some sense, feminism shouldn't just be about creating better fulfillment for women. It should be about creating better fulfillment for men. I mean, why do so many men spend so much time in their offices and see so little of their kids? That's one of the reasons why I could never imagine doing certain kinds of jobs. I was too attached to see my kids. And I think, the rules of the workplace that oblige men to put in long hours at the expense of seeing their families, whereas at least as damaging to men as to women. And the damage done by those rules of wasteful signaling in the workplace fall at least as badly on men as on women. And so I think sort of feminism is about liberating both genders, all genders.
Mm-hmm. There's much more richness in the book and your other writing, and I look forward to your next book. Last question. You head up something called the Institute for Advanced Studies at Toulouse. A lot of people talk about interdisciplinarity and talk about exposing themselves to people outside of their main discipline, but the kind of rat race and the competitive signaling that takes place within your discipline oftentimes makes it difficult. How can we, as educational institutions, encourage more exposure to thoughts outside of our main discipline? How does the Institute for Advanced Studies do this? And is it a role model? Is it something that other universities can follow?
Well, I mean, I would hate to say we are better role. I mean, there are other role models and places that we ourselves have been inspired by. So I wouldn't want to exaggerate our own pioneering work. I think pioneering work is happening all over the world, and many places are thinking about this. I mean, one paradox is that big American firms went through, and as any management course will tell you, went through a revolution in the early 20th century from a form in which they were structured by functions, so that the main departments would be sort of the production department, and then there would be the marketing department, and then there would be the after sales service department, and so on. And they went through they moved from this unitary form, as it's described, to a multi-divisional form, in which there would be the mid-sized cars and the big cars and the small cars, or there would be the paints division and the fertilizer division and the pharmaceuticals division and so on of the big chemical firm. And the important point about that was that work was structured around tasks to be done rather than professional skills that were required for doing them. And so the genius of people like Sloan, who ran General Motors, was to realize that the people who needed to talk to each other in a firm were those who were engaged in the same task, not the people who had done the same professional training together. So, if a salesperson is going out to sell a Chevrolet out in the Midwest somewhere and meets customers saying, sorry, your Chevrolet's brakes are no good. They're not reliable. When the salesperson goes back to HQ, the person they should be talking to is not other salespeople with whom they would just sell sort of ways of trying to divert customers' attention from the brakes to think about other stuff. they need to be talking to the production people and saying, guys, your brakes are no good. I'm having a hard time selling your car and you've got to fix those brakes. So that was Sloane's genius, that the people who have to talk to each other are the people who are engaged in a collective task, not the people who share the same, as it were, disciplinary skill. Now, universities are a century behind big American firms. We're still organized by disciplinary, shared disciplinary competence, and not mostly by research task or research problem. And so I think that the challenge is, there are reasons for that. It's not an accident that, production firms like General Motors or DuPont got into the reorganization on multi-divisional lines so much earlier than universities did. And we can go into what some of those reasons are. But the point is, universities have been very slow to think about the benefits of organizing people around problems rather than around disciplinary skills. Partly because the disciplinary skills take many years to acquire and so on. But there's still something a bit dysfunctional about having the people who share the disciplinary skills talking to each other rather than the people who are working on a problem, like, say, climate change or political cohesion or underdevelopment or whatever. And of course, more and more universities are trying to, and not just universities, but other think tanks and so on, are trying to organize people around problems like climate change and underdevelopment and disease. Actually, COVID-19 has been very good for multidisciplinary research. And what I think is necessary is to try to ensure that recruitment within disciplinary departments internalizes the benefits for the solving of problems, of getting people who are used to thinking in terms of problem solving approach to their work, rather than just I have shiny disciplinary tools. And so let me mention a number of things which I think are encouraging in this respect. So, when I started out as a graduate student nearly 40 years ago, getting published was, first of all, fairly easy, but also lots of people who published in journals were not doing work that was, say, statistically always very competent. And so much of the work that referees did in journals, for example, was just weeding out the statistically incompetent material. Nowadays, I think researchers are so much better trained that the overwhelming majority of papers that are submitted to journals are statistically extremely competent. A lot of them are very uninteresting, but they're statistically entirely competent. And what that means is that more and more, the job of good referees and editors is not, weeding out the person who can't calculate their standard errors correctly. It's about finding the paper that has really framed the problem in an interesting way and told a story. We talked about narrative at the beginning of this podcast, and I come back again and again to the fact that narratives infuse many of the things we do, even when we're being most scientific. So good research papers often tell a convincing story about what's going on, which obviously has to be backed up with completely sound statistics. But this completely sound statistics are only the first part of the project. What you also have to have is putting the statistical findings into a context in which people say, yes, that answers a question in a convincing way with a mechanism we can believe in, we can tell a story around. That answers a question we care about. And so my feeling is that it's actually going to become easier in the future for people who have done interdisciplinary research to publish even in the disciplinary journals. Because to put it bluntly, the disciplinary journals now have an excess of disciplinarily competent submissions. And the things that the factors that make the difference between the ones they really want to publish and the ones they don't are the ones that just have some of that imagination and which tie all of the hard disciplinary work to answering a really interesting question. And you can't answer a really interesting question unless you've thought about the broader interdisciplinary context into which it fits.
Now, of course, it's much harder to admit PhD students based on their imagination as opposed to their technical competence, right? You know, it's hard to predict who's going to be the creative person 10 years later. Okay, tell us about the book. When is the book coming out, and what's the topic? Next book.
Okay, so the next book is going to be called "The Origins of Enchantment: How Religions Compete." It's not written yet, although I've done quite a lot of the research for it, and I have a sabbatical next year when I step down starting in September when I step down from being director of IST, and I plan to finish the manuscript during my sabbatical year. And it's under contract to Princeton, who published both of the other books. So I really hope, believe me, Princeton really hopes they've been thinking that this book was some kind of millenarian promise, which was never going to come true. And I think they'll be at least as relieved as I am when the manuscript is actually done.
Paul, thanks so much for joining today.
This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.